A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's turn our attention to warmongers and saber rattlers and how Christians make sense of some of the geopolitics with the biggest players like Russia and China. Stephen McAlpine back with us, award-winning Christian author, pastor and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. Hey, Steve, a special welcome back to 2020.
Great to be with you, Neil. It feels like the good old days of the culture war are well behind us while we're waiting for actual war. I'm being a bit facetious there, but yeah.
I know. Well, that's an interesting perspective to have because, the culture war seems like it's so much more important. Then all of a sudden someone's threatening to drop a nuclear bomb and maybe there's some other priorities that take place.
Yeah.
And you know what? As I understand it, Stephen, you're anticipating, and rightly so as a Christian leader and as a commentator, but anticipating perhaps a more intense period of instability ahead. We might be thinking things are getting better. You're thinking, what about the scenarios if things get a little worse?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It's been a fairly stable 7 decades, apparently. But there's been war everywhere. But what it feels like now is that some of the things start to join up. And I think that's probably a conflict issue.
Okay, things joining up, as in it's one thing to look at one single conflict happening one part of the world, but then there's a whole bunch of other conflicts. Maybe they're not even in the headlines, but then there are manoeuvring relationships, changing global relationships, people aligning with one side and another. That's the sort of thing you're talking about, and all of a sudden you start to realise that there are people on sides that you didn't anticipate before.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And obviously a lot of this comes back to Trump, as in like everyone's talking about that issue, about Ukraine and UK and Europe. And just yesterday, Sir Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, said we're really going to go boots and all maybe, but also a lot more money into Ukraine on the back of Donald Trump's comments about Ukraine last week, where there's a bit of a blow up with he and Zelensky. And I think in one sense, you've got to remember that Donald Trump, there's an amorality to a guy who writes a book called The Art of the Deal. So it feels like that's probably where we're at, that deal making seems to be the way we're going to go with these big powers. And some people are going to be losers in that, and some people are going to be winners.
You know, a lot of us will be thinking through what it means and which side we stand on, because that big blow-up with Zelensky and Trump and J.D. Vance that we're probably all aware of, and then Zelensky's arrival in the UK and the cozying up of perhaps a reinforcement of the support of the UK for Ukraine, and where our own leaders sit. So you've got Anthony Albanese, who's saying, well, we're standing with Ukraine, and probably all of our listeners will be thinking, of course we stand with Ukraine. What's all of this thought that we might not? So this sort of thing, there's confusion that begins to divide opinion here.
Yeah, and I think the first thing to say is if you're a Christian commentator on anything, that doesn't make you an expert on geopolitics all of the time. And I think as we watch, a couple of things I'd say. Donald Trump said some things about the Ukraine situation that I think were plain wrong. They weren't true. The one thing that I think he was right about is that Europe hasn't pulled its weight. And if someone who writes a book called The Art of the Deal wants to make a deal, he'll probably say and do anything to get a deal to happen, which is what he wanted, was Europe to pay a bigger percentage of its GDP to do something about it. So it's very much an isolationist thing from America. We want out of this war, and it's we'll do whatever we need to get out of it, and we're not going to pay for it. And suddenly Europe's starting to pay for it. So in one sense, Donald Trump's kind of won that one, even if he didn't go about it in a way that I think politically was as honest as he should have, to be honest.
And it's interesting when you use the terminology, sort of an amorality about the art of the deal, and wondering whether, we ought to always think that our leaders are going to be speaking in the sort of terms that we understand, because oftentimes global political manoeuvring might actually mean that there's going to be a wedge that's being driven in here that might actually cause there to be some more debate about a particular issue or in the state of Ukraine in this instance about how those things might eventually be resolved. Sometimes you might need a crisis to actually bring some extra new resolution. Is that possible, that it could be a part of the thinking?
Well, looking favourably on what's happened now, do we want 4 more years of giving Ukraine just enough weapons to keep it going, but not enough to stop it? I mean, that was part of the issue, I think, that Europe could have done something about. But it feels like, Putin is he's not beyond going outside the borders of his own country to kill his opponents. So there's something really dastardly about the way he behaves. But realpolitik says something has to be done somewhere. How you get there, how you do justice in this world fully and finally, is something that we as Christians don't believe can happen fully. We want to act justly, but we don't believe that we're necessarily going to get everything that we want in this age. And that's probably what, as Christians, we need to keep a mind of, that, Psalm 2 says, "Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain?" And you have to take that into consideration as a Christian when you look at the geopolitics.
Let's talk about some of the other more, maybe you call it sideline issues, but, we've got live firing exercises off our Australian coast and, our political leaders jostling for how they might approach that. Some saying they need to be heavy-handed and telling the Chinese, what they ought to be doing. Others saying, well, don't ruffle too many feathers here. There's all sorts of challenging ways to think about what's happening, but the issues around China and Taiwan and what they might be observing as to the way the world reacts around Russia and Ukraine. These sorts of things, they are in some ways interconnected because everyone's watching everyone else.
Yeah, I did think that when I saw the Chinese warships. And Christopher Pyne, the former defence minister in the government, said that, what did you expect? China's allowed to do that and Australia's allowed to do that, but we don't have anything to push back with. If China wants to do what it wants in the sea, in the southern parts of the ocean, it can, because it's international waters and we can't do anything about it. And that kind of brings us to the point that we probably in Western nations have just assumed that if we can just show people good reason and show leaderships around the world good reason why they shouldn't do something, they won't. But that's not how people work, and that's not how nations work. So the West has come adrift in its understanding from how other strong nations are thinking about things. And I think that's part of our issue. We're slightly naive and we've been used to a lot of, global prosperity, that globalism will bring all these good things. But all these bad things have rushed in at the same time.
And if territory is negotiable, as we're seeing with the possibility of ceasefire, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what does that do to China's thinking about negotiable territory in Taiwan? These sorts of things, I guess, are the thoughts that may be going through the minds of leaders when they're thinking about how they actually increase their territory.
Yeah, well, and that's all in the context of people probably on the hard left saying there's no such thing as national borders. Well, and then on the other hand, they're saying you should honour Ukraine's sovereignty. You can't have, is it the best of times or the worst of times? We've got to have some sort of national understanding of sovereignty, but at the same time, we have to realise that some people who are bigger and stronger are going to do what they want. And the price that you have to pay to stop them doing what they want, sometimes nations don't want to pay that price. And that's where Europe is in the situation now of saying, what price will we pay to keep Ukraine's national sovereignty?
Let's talk about taking sides for a moment here, Steve, because, oftentimes we are quick to take sides. We're quick to believe what our own national leaders say. And perhaps when it comes to taking sides over Israel and Hamas, it's very easy for us to, as Christians, and knowing some of the facts as they unfolded, that, yes, of course, we're taking the side of Israel to be able to defend itself against a terror opponent. Taking sides, though, yes, we were able to see the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It wasn't that hard to take sides there. Taking sides against China, given that they're a major trading partner, but we're also key allies of the United States. These sorts of things might lead us to taking sides, but what do you think is a Christian view of how we look at things here? I've got a suspicion you're going to say take your time before you actually settle on a hard-line position.
Yeah, well, that would be the opposite of what I sometimes do in the House about an issue, but that's exactly what I was going to land on. It's interesting, and because I would say that as someone who's more conservative, and I also see on the Israel issue, I'd say I side with Israel, and especially as I see the anti-Semitism. But a Christian pastor who's a friend of mine, who's from Lebanon, said, I have a different perspective on this. Let's have lunch together and talk about it. And we had a good conversation over lunch. And, he holds a different perspective to me, even though he's not pro-Hamas. But he said to me, there's no such thing as a two-state solution in the Middle East, because the only thing that's going to solve this in the end is the gospel, and whether the gospel solves it in this age or the age to come is the issue. And I think as Westerners, we like to think that we can solve everything, and we just can't.
Interesting when you say in this age or the age to come, because we're often very quick, aren't we, to, as Christian believers, to apply a biblical end-time scenario to the things that are going on right now. Oftentimes that might lead us to a head in the sand or a do-nothing attitude, whereas, in fact, if Christ does not return, the age to come might be where the gospel needs to resolve these sorts of issues. What are your thoughts here about our attitude as Christian believers and taking sides?
Well, in one sense, some things can be solved by Christian effort at some level. You think of the end of slavery and the way that the Clapham sect and William Wilberforce, they didn't go, well, we'll wait to the age to come to solve that. You think about civil rights movements. You think about even people protesting against abortion issues, that sometimes that does change people and does change legislation. But if you look at the book of Daniel, for example, the first half of the book is seismic geopolitical, chaos. And the second half of the book is a flip side picture of seeing that chaos from God's perspective. And for Daniel, it's two very different sides of the book. The churning sea of history was throwing up all these crazy beasts. And it was in the midst of that Daniel sees one that looks like a son of man, a true ruler, a true leader who will one day rule with all authority. And that didn't then make Daniel, God didn't say at the end of the book of Daniel to Daniel, well, don't do anything. He said, go your way. He's got to keep serving, keep working, keep living for God. But God has sorted this out and will deal with it at the end of time. That doesn't mean we don't do anything, but it does mean that we have a hope beyond it being solved in this age. We can't be as angst-ridden about it as those who have no hope.
Again, if you have no hope, you're going to be guided by all sorts of fear factors in the way that you might think about your own personal security, your family's safety, your community, your church, your position, your career, all those sorts of things. But in some sense here, and this might be hard for us sometimes to ascertain, but having a Christian view of the world actually helps us deal with and navigating through all these things. How do you see this, we could call it a little bit of a superpower that comes from your belief in God and understanding and trusting in Him. How do you think that is outworked in our hearts and lives, being able to approach the challenging times ahead?
Well, I would say the first thing, if you've written a lot of tweets about what's happening in Europe and US at the moment, and you've never prayed about it, then perhaps you aren't as godly in your position on where it's all going as you think. In one sense, we're called to pray about these things. The second thing is that we are called to do what is right and true and godly, but unless you're someone who's a Christian in a major leadership position, you have very little say in how this is going to play out. And as Western Christians, we like to think we have more power. Now, for example, my daughter's boyfriend, his parents have just come back on furlough as missionaries from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And 70 Christians were beheaded there the other week. And they left just before the full coup. And you think, how did that happen? How did that suddenly happen? And there's all these little things happening, and we should be praying for the Christians in the DRC. we should be praying for Christians around the world. And that's what I would say is, first and foremost, we pray for those who are believers around the world stuck in these situations.
And we find ourselves in not just a theoretical belief, but those things that in our own economy, we're a part of God's economy in that, aren't we? Because there must be some things that we can do. And as you say, if you never pray about these things, you'll never realise that there might be something that you're called to do. But what do you think we can do? Because if we are, in fact, so often powerless and we don't have any way to affect the outcome of a global conflict, what is it you think we can do, perhaps locally, that fulfills the calling on our lives?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, Nehemiah, when he was rebuilding Jerusalem, heard about the enemies that were going to come and destroy the wall. So it says he prayed, and I set a guard on the wall. He did both and, right? So part of the issue for us is we do pray, but then we also look for ways to say, how can I be in my setting? It might be that I contact someone in government, but that may be a futile thing anyway because they're going to vote according to party lines or things, whatever. But it also is, how do I engage with my neighbour? How do I engage with those who are my enemy in these arguments? Because it is going to be the gospel in the long term that actually resolves this. I don't think there's any sort of nationalistic Christianity that's going to actually stop or prevent or redirect the things that are going on at the moment. Because I firmly believe that it's the nations have set themselves against the King in heaven. And so one of the prayers in the Bible is, come Lord Jesus, come. Part of our prayer is that Jesus comes back.
Yes, and when we talk about the things that are going on today, I mean, because most of us are not going to be elected MPs, and as you say, even when you are, you've got to vote along party lines, so there's all sorts of people pulling the strings there, and you're not going to be necessarily a senator in an upper house and reviewing whatever things are happening, and you recognise that your morality is being set up by a political process. But where we do have power is in our own families and our own communities. This idea of cultivating the sorts of good relationships, the love your neighbour as yourself. Do you think this is something that we perhaps need to embrace more than just having an opinion about, global issues?
Yeah, well, I think it's easy to bypass the local issue and virtue signal on the global. That's probably part of our issue. So for me, having lunch with a friend of mine who disagrees with me is probably more challenging than firing off a tweet, because I have to listen to someone else's position who I don't necessarily agree with. And so that's what I want to say is practice it in the small things and see where it goes. And I think that's going to be helpful for us. And pray for the nations. Pray for them in church and pray for them individually as well. Pray for your leaders. We're told to pray for our leaders in Romans. And that's Paul telling us that God has put leaders in charge to do justice. So we want them to do justice and we want them to avoid injustice. The fact that God is in control above that should actually dial some of our anxiety down.
An old saying about being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. The thought that we're called to, a multifaceted way of influence, aren't we, Steve? And getting the context right for each individual. And you can't just sort of a blanket context for everybody in some sense, but everyone needs to perhaps even, assess where we are in our own lives, in our own circle of influence, and ensure that we're doing what we're called to do in that particular place. And that leads me to the context of a local church too, because you can see yourself as separate from a local church, but being part of a local church is more likely to be an empowering factor for you in being able to serve your community, isn't it?
It is. And look, I think there are people that can have global impact. You think of the opposition defence spokesman, Andrew Hastie, who's a Christian. And one of the things that's interesting about him, and I know him a little bit, is that he's a churchgoer, and he's a regular churchgoer whenever he can get there. Because in the end, I think people like Andrew would believe that, God will be the ultimate judge and organiser of everything that's happening. But it doesn't mean he then gets out of politics.
No, and we've got to know our place and even have a vision for moving forward and a strategy to do those things that occupy until he comes or until we are leaving this world. Stephen McAlpine, always great wisdom as we talk about some of these things. I want to thank you so much. Stephen McAlpine's an award-winning Christian author, pastor, and national consultant for churches and Christian schools. You can connect with Stephen McAlpine at his website, stephenmcalpine.com. Lots of great articles you'll be able to access there, and the books that he's written as well. Stephen, thank you so much for another great insight and updating listeners today with these things, and appreciate you being on 2020.
Thanks so much, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.